A few years back, I was on my lunch break, scrolling on my phone, and I pulled up an account I almost never check. The number staring back was smaller than it had been the week before, smaller than the month before that. My thumb hovered right over a button that said move to cash. Heart pounding, telling myself I was being smart, being safe. I never pressed it. Not because I'm braver than anybody else, but because a friend 20 years older than me had lived through that exact feeling before, and she talked me down that same afternoon. What she told me is what I want to tell you. The people who quietly came out ahead after the hard stretches in this country's history weren't smarter than everybody else. They weren't calm by accident either. They just behaved differently. There are 7 patterns behind that. And pattern number 1 starts with the very moment I just told you about. Pattern 1. They kept their hands still when everything in their body was screaming at them to move. Every hard stretch in modern memory, the early 80s, the early 2000s, 2008, 2020, created a moment like the one I just described. A number dropping, a headline shouting, and a very real, very human urge to grab whatever's left and run. Here's what that actually means for your money. The people who came out ahead weren't the ones who never felt scared. They felt exactly what I felt at my desk that day. The difference is they didn't act on the fear in the moment it showed up. They gave it a day, sometimes a week, before making any real decision. Because fear is a terrible financial advisor. And a very convincing one. Quick note before we keep going. Everything in this video is general information based on historical patterns, not personalized financial advice. Your own situation, your own timeline, your own risk always deserves its own conversation with somebody who knows your full picture. Think about the last time you made a big decision while your heart was racing, a reply-all email you regretted, a purchase at 2 a.m. Money decisions made from panic tend to look a lot like those. Technically an action, rarely a good one. The everyday version of this pattern is simple, almost boring. When the number drops and your stomach drops with it. You don't have to do anything right that second. Nothing about your account requires an emergency decision in the next 10 minutes. Give yourself the day. Call somebody steadier than you feel. Sleep on it. The families who quietly built wealth through hard decades weren't gamblers who got lucky. They were people who understood that the worst financial decisions almost always get made in the first 24 hours of fear. Pattern 2. They protected their income like it was the whole game, because it was. Here's what that means for your money. The surest way to turn a bad stretch into a permanent loss isn't a market dropping. It's a person being forced to sell something at exactly the wrong moment because they lost their income and had no other way to pay the bills. Think about 2 neighbors living through the exact same rough year. One of them loses their job 3 months in and has to pull money out of whatever they've got, at whatever the price happens to be that week, because rent doesn't wait for a recovery. The other one keeps working, maybe picks up extra hours, maybe takes on a little side work they'd normally never bother with, and never has to touch a single dollar they weren't already planning to spend. Same downturn, wildly different outcome. Not because one of them was smarter with the money itself, but because one of them was never forced to make a decision on somebody else's timeline. During the hardest stretches of the last century, this was just survival instinct. Families understood it without anyone having to explain it. Today, it looks a lot less dramatic. Keeping your resume current, staying visible at work, keeping a skill or a license active even when your job feels perfectly secure. If this is landing for you, if you're the kind of person who wants to actually build something instead of just getting by, go ahead and hit subscribe right now, because the next 5 patterns build directly on this one, and I don't want you to miss where this is headed. The everyday version of this pattern isn't glamorous. It's having a rough idea of what you do for income in the next 30 days if your main paycheck disappeared tomorrow, and actually thinking it through before you ever need the answer. People who quietly got ahead treated their ability to earn as the asset they protected first, above everything else, because an income you can count on is what keeps every other decision from becoming an emergency. Pattern 3. They kept a cushion of cash sitting around doing nothing, on purpose. And that nothing was the whole point. Here's what that means for your money. A cash buffer isn't there to grow. It's there so that when life throws something at you, a car repair, a medical bill, a slow month at work, you're pulling from a pile you already set aside, instead of pulling from somewhere that was still supposed to be growing. Picture two families again. Same emergency, same $700 transmission repair showing up out of nowhere. One family has a few months of expenses sitting in a separate account they don't touch for anything else. They write the check, mildly annoyed, and move on with their week. The other family doesn't have that cushion, so they either put it on a card at 20-something% interest, or they pull money out of something they were counting on to keep growing untouched. Same repair bill, two completely different financial years that follow it. The everyday version of this pattern is unglamorous and slow to build, which is exactly why most people skip it. Start with 1 month of basic expenses set aside, somewhere boring and hard to touch on impulse. Then build toward 3. The people who came out ahead after hard stretches weren't the ones with the biggest income. They were the ones who could absorb a surprise without it turning into a crisis that forced their hand. Pattern 4. When everybody else was running for the exits, they got curious instead of scared. This is not a permission slip to do anything reckless, and it's definitely not a signal to grab your down payment money or your rent money and go do something dramatic with it. Please don't do that. This is about temperament, not tactics. Here's what it actually means for your money. When something you'd normally want, a house, a car, a small business, even a piece of equipment for a side hustle, is suddenly available for a lot less than it was 6 months ago because everyone else is too scared to buy, that's often when the actual value shows up. Fear doesn't just move markets, it moves prices on everything, from real estate to used cars to entire small businesses that owners are desperate to unload. History is full of ordinary versions of this. Small business owners who picked up a struggling competitor's equipment for pennies during a slow year. Families who bought a home nobody else wanted to bid on during a soft market. None of them had special access or insider information. They just kept showing up with open eyes while everyone around them looked away. Think about somebody you might know who bought a house during a slow, scary stretch when nobody else wanted to make an offer, and ended up with a better price and less competition than they would have gotten in a hot market. That's the pattern, played out in plain sight. The everyday version isn't about timing anything perfectly. It's about staying awake and interested when everyone around you has checked out and gone into a defensive crouch. The people who quietly got ahead didn't need to be first. They needed to still be paying attention when almost everybody else had stopped. Pattern 5. They let the headlines say whatever they wanted and made their decisions somewhere much quieter than a news feed. Here's what that means for your money. During every hard stretch in modern memory, the loudest voices predicted total collapse, permanent damage, a world that would never look the same again. Some of those voices were on television. Now, most of them are in your pocket, updating every few minutes. The people who quietly got ahead weren't unaware of what was happening. They just refused to let a headline written to grab their attention also get to steer their bank account. There's a real difference between staying informed and staying plugged into a feed engineered to make you feel like you need to do something right now. Think about how you feel after 20 minutes of scrolling financial news on a rough week. Wound up, jittery, convinced something terrible is about to happen to you personally. Now, think about how differently you'd feel making the exact same decision after a full night's sleep and zero scrolling. The everyday version of this pattern is closing the app. Checking your accounts on a schedule you set, not one a notification sets for you. Getting your information from something you chose on purpose instead of whatever's shouting loudest that day. Calm decisions come from a calm information diet, and that's something completely within your control, no matter what the headlines are doing. I'm curious how this shows up in your own family. Maybe a grandparent who bought a house when nobody else wanted to make an offer, Or a parent who never touched their savings no matter how bad the news got? Tell me about it down in the comments, because those stories genuinely shape what I make next. Pattern 6. They measured their progress in decades, not in days, which meant a bad Tuesday simply didn't count for much. Here's what that means for your money. If you're checking your progress every single day, every dip looks like a disaster, and every gain looks like proof you were right all along. And neither one of those feelings is actually useful information. The people who came out ahead after hard stretches zoomed out. They asked what things looked like compared to 5 years ago, not 5 days ago. A rough quarter, even a genuinely rough year, barely shows up at all once you're looking at a 15 or 20-year stretch. But if you're only ever looking at the last 24 hours, that same rough year feels like the whole story. Think about a garden. Nobody digs up a seed every morning to check if it's growing yet. You'd kill the thing you're trying to grow. Money left to work on a long timeline behaves the same way. Constant checking doesn't speed anything up. It just adds stress and tempts you into disturbing something that was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. Ask yourself honestly, how differently would you feel about your own money right now if you only let yourself look at it twice a year instead of twice a day? The everyday version of this pattern is picking a schedule, once a quarter, maybe twice a year, and looking at your money then and only then. Everything in between is just noise dressed up as information. Pattern 7, and this is the one that ties every other pattern together. They let boring things repeat over and over for years without ever needing them to feel exciting. Here's what that means for your money. None of the other 6 patterns are dramatic. Staying calm isn't dramatic. Keeping a buffer isn't dramatic. Turning off the news isn't dramatic. And that's exactly why most people don't stick with any of them. Boring doesn't feel like it's working, right up until the day you look back and realize it's the only thing that ever actually worked. Think about the people you know who quietly seem to be doing fine, decade after decade, without ever having a dramatic financial story to tell. Chances are they're not doing anything you haven't heard of. They're doing the same handful of unglamorous things on repeat without drama for so long that it stopped feeling like effort and just became who they are. That's not luck. That's a temperament, built one boring, repeated decision at a time. It's the automatic transfer nobody talks about at parties. It's the same modest habits, kept up through the good years and the scary ones alike, never abandoned just because they weren't exciting. The everyday version of this pattern is simple to say and genuinely hard to live. Pick the handful of things you know you should be doing with your money, and then just keep doing them, especially in the exact moments when it feels pointless or scary. The people who quietly got ahead after every hard stretch this country has been through weren't chasing something exciting. They were repeating something boring, on purpose, for long enough that it turned into wealth. Here's how these 7 patterns actually work together, because none of them do much on their own. Quiet hands keep you from making a permanent decision out of temporary fear. A protected income and a real cash buffer make sure you're never forced into a decision on somebody else's timeline in the first place. Staying curious when everyone else panics means you're actually paying attention when opportunity shows up looking like bad news. Turning the volume down on the headlines and measuring your life in decades instead of days keeps your hands steady long enough for any of this to matter. And repeating the boring stuff, especially the parts that don't feel like they're working yet, is what turns 6 good instincts into an actual result. None of this happens in a single dramatic moment, no matter how satisfying that would be to tell you. It happens in 1,000 small, unremarkable choices, most of which nobody else will ever see you make. Sitting on your hands instead of hitting sell, making the boring transfer again this month, closing the app instead of scrolling it for the 10th time today. None of those moments feel like the moment your life changed. But string enough of them together through enough hard stretches, and one day you look up and realize you're one of the people who quietly came out ahead. The same way that friend of mine once was. The same way I'm slowly becoming. One boring, repeated choice at a time. So back to that afternoon at my desk, thumb hovering over that button. I didn't press it. And looking back, that's the least interesting part of the story. The interesting part is that a year later, I couldn't even remember which specific dip had scared me so badly, because it had already smoothed itself out into just one more Tuesday along a much longer road. That's usually how it goes, and it's how it's gone for ordinary people through every hard stretch this country has lived through, long before I ever showed up to talk about it. If any of these 7 patterns hit close to home for you, or if you caught yourself thinking about a moment when you almost pressed your own version of that button, I'd genuinely like to know. And if you want more of this, more of the mindset side of building wealth instead of just the spreadsheet side, hit subscribe and share this with somebody who needs to hear it. Because next time, I'm walking through the exact conversation I had with myself the day I finally stopped panic checking my accounts for good.